Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class, where we have been trying to build our understanding of the Christian worldview, and we've been doing that by looking at the book of Genesis, because so much of what we understand about the biblical Christian worldview is established from the beginning right there in Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. I mean, that's a good place to start. And we talked about sin and how that came into the world and how the Lord used Noah to save people into the next world after the flood. And we then went to the life of Abraham, which is what we've been looking at for a number of weeks now. And I'm going to say that I think we're finally at the end of the story of Abraham, because in this chapter 25, which is what we're looking at today, is when he finally dies. And it's been, we've learned so many lessons from Abraham, and I think even at the end of his life we're going to learn a few more lessons. So let's see what's happening here in chapter 25. The first verse says that Abraham had taken another wife whose name was Keturah. And then it goes on and it lists all the children that he had through her. And probably, if you think about the time frame here, Abraham must have lived another, well, I don't know, 50 years or so after the death of Sarah, because he is 175 when he dies. And so all kinds of things are happening in this last chapter of his life. And this is just one of those things. And it's interesting how you follow the history, the family history of some of these descendants. And some of the names that are given, you never hear anything more about. But some of the names you do hear more about throughout the course of the biblical story. One of them, in this case of one of Keturah's sons, his name was Midian. And we're going to see that Moses, when he flees to the wilderness, ends up going to the land of Midian. And there he marries his wife, Zipporah. Well, we haven't got to that story yet. But it's interesting to see how all of these people and their descendants end up establishing their own identity as tribes and eventually nations. And so when God promised Abraham that from him would come many nations, we're really seeing the beginning of that here in this chapter. Verses 5 and 6 continue the story a little bit, and it says that Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. A few things to talk about here. One is this whole thing about concubines. In our culture today and in the way we practice Christianity today, the basic formula is one man, one woman for one lifetime. And so we might ask the question, what is all this thing about Abraham, this man of God who has all these concubines? In other words, he's having children through all these other women. And I think a few things to keep in mind. One is that this was a different time. It was a different culture. But also, at this point, the law had not yet been given. That law that talks about adultery, thou shalt not commit adultery, and you stay faithful to one wife, or one man, or one wife. That really hadn't been established yet. Plus, I think that as part of God's permissive will, I guess we use that term sometimes, when people do things that are not exactly right, or say by our standards today, that it just wouldn't fly. In fact, it would be almost illegal to have all these wives. But God kind of works things out so that a lot of the promises he made for Abraham to become a great nation are fulfilled through this practice of just having all of these kids. So we also read in that verse is that Abraham decided that he was going to, and this is kind of a no-brainer, that he was going to give all of his possessions to Isaac. keeping in mind the fact that Isaac was the son that Abraham and Sarah were, just longing to have, and it was the one that was promised. And of course, they kind of tried to help God a little bit by having a son through Hagar, who was Sarah's maid servant, and that was Ishmael. And we're going to think a little bit more about that and see a little bit about what happened to him as well in this chapter. But right now, it's interesting in this little part we just read about how he gave gifts to all these other children, but that he also sent them away. And why was that? Well, we already saw the contention between Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac was born, and Ishmael's looking at this little kid, his little kid brother, and making fun of him and having no respect for him at all, and probably seeing him as a challenge to his own ability to inherit the things that he thought he should be able to inherit. And of course, Abraham now gives Isaac everything, and as a result, he sends these other children away. And I think the reason behind that is because he didn't want to have Isaac to have any kind of contention about what he had received from his father, about his inheritance, and also about the authority that was handed down to him. Because Abraham, blessed him, and he didn't just give him a bunch of stuff, a lot of money. He gave him the authority. He actually handed down his position as leader of the tribe to Isaac. And for that reason, so there wouldn't be any contention, that he sent these other children away. This is a theme that comes up in the Bible. When we look at men who think they need more than one wife, and you have the sibling rivalries. We see that in the story of Jacob and Joseph, and how his brothers had sold him into slavery because they were so jealous of him. We see it in the life of David. And by the time he's old, his kids are all fighting over who's going to be the next king. And a lot of that was just based on the fact that you had these children that all had different mothers. They had the same father, but different mothers, and there was all this contention that came about. So it's not really a good formula to think that you can get away for a husband to have more than one wife, and it just doesn't work that way. This is a pretty clear formula. It's also interesting that he sends these children away towards the east. I don't know if there's really any significance to that, but when Adam and Eve were chased out of the garden, they went towards the east. And if you'll remember, when Cain was punished and exiled from his family, he went to the east. And also the Tower of Babel, when the Lord confused the nations and they all had to leave, they all went towards the east. I don't know what it is about heading towards the east, but it seems like when you get in trouble, that's the direction you go. I'm not sure why they wouldn't have gone any other direction. And it probably doesn't mean anything. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But it's just one of those consistent tendencies in the Bible. Well, let's continue on, and we'll read verses 7 to 11. Abraham lived 175 years, and then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, and an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre, in the field of Ephron, son of Zoar the Hittite. You remember that story about how Abraham had bought this land from Ephron the Hittite so that he could have a place to bury Sarah. So now they're burying Abraham in the same land. And a few interesting things about this. Well, one is it says specifically that he's 175 years old, which, we think back in the before the flood, and people were living to be like 600 years old. Abraham was 930. Methuselah was 969 years. But after the flood, and I think we talked about this, the age limit kind of decreased significantly. There's a lot of theories as to why that might have been. But the bottom line was, at the time of Abraham, 175 was a ripe old age, which was just another sign of God's blessing upon him. And it also gives him the opportunity to see, as we said, the fulfillment of these promises that God had made to him, especially the one about him becoming a great nation. It's also interesting in that passage we just read how Ishmael shows up to the funeral. And, I think this is something that there maybe is another lesson about being a good father. And we know that Abraham didn't despise Ishmael. He loved him. In fact, he prayed that God would bless him. And that's exactly what God did. God promised him that he would take care of his son Ishmael. And we're going to see in just a bit that that's exactly what God does. So they are reconciled. Isaac and Ishmael are reconciled at Abraham's funeral. And it's interesting, when somebody dies. In fact, I was just at a funeral a few days ago, and it was kind of a family matriarch. She was 90 years old. She passed away, and I knew a little bit about the background in the family, and I knew there were some, I'm not saying it was a dysfunctional family, but they had issues. And they weren't all getting along all that well together. But at the funeral service, when they were all thinking about her, you really sensed that they were making an effort to be closer together. Because when you lose someone like that, who really, and they went on to talk about how great a blessing she was and how she helped raise many of the kids, and they had a whole ton of love and respect for her. And when somebody like that goes, when you lose somebody like that, I think it affects the next generation, and they got to start thinking about, what did I learn from her? What do we learn from those who pass on before us? And we need to step up. You step up in terms of your responsibility to the family. And it was one thing that they were saying at this funeral, that they wanted to, spend more family time together. And so when somebody like that dies, I think it really does challenge us to think about what they meant to us, and, what Abraham meant to Isaac and to Ishmael as well. So we also, now the next thing we read in verse 11, after Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahane Roy. I'm not sure where that was, but I think there's a difference between being blessed and receiving an inheritance from your father, which is what he did. We already read that. Abraham gave all of his worldly goods to Isaac. But also, it says here that God blessed Isaac. It's great to be blessed by your father. I think we all like to please especially our father, what he thinks of us. It's the little kid playing baseball, and he's up to bat, and he's looking over to see if his dad is watching, because we have this, I guess, built-in desire to please our parents. And what we receive from them, I think it's a sign of the respect that we have for them. And I think in this case, what Isaac received from Abraham was his approval as, father to son, which would have been very important to him. But also, Abraham had this spiritual dimension to him. And Abraham had this relationship with God. And beside all the money and stuff that he passed on to Isaac, I think one of the most valuable things that he passed on was this relationship to God. And so it says here that God blessed Isaac. So he's double blessed, I guess you could say. Abraham, his father, blesses him, and God himself blesses him. And, some of us don't luck out quite so well in terms of our own earthly fathers. And, it's always a shame to see that. But every single one of us can identify God and can know God in heaven as our Father. and we can receive those blessings that come from him when we live a life of obedience. Basically, just like we're saying with marriage, God has set an established pattern that really works. And it's one man, one woman, one lifetime. That is God's standard. And if you follow that, you will automatically inherit the blessings of God. Because you're doing things in accordance to the way he has things set up. That's really part of our Christian world view, that this is the right thing to do. We know what's not right, and you can kind of prove it from what we read here in the scripture. But you can appreciate this wonderful relationship that Abraham and Isaac had, and Abraham blessing him and God himself blessing him. Well, this whole chapter ends up talking about Ishmael, and this is another one of these genealogies that we look at, and a list of his sons are given here. And in all, we read that he had 12 sons, and each one of them becomes like a prince over his own family line. And if you'll remember, I don't know if you remember or not, but back in Genesis 17:20, when Abraham had to send Ishmael away, and he sought God's blessing, he asked God to be with Ishmael, and this is what happened in Genesis 17:20. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I will make him into a great nation. So this is kind of interesting, isn't it? Because here's this prophetic statement that God had made before, while Ishmael was still like just a kid. And he said he's going to be the father, he's going to have 12 children. And now we're seeing that that's exactly what happened, just like God prophesied, just like God promised. And the interesting thing about that is that all of these 12 children each become like a tribe in themselves. Each one becomes like a prince. And if you follow the history, you can see that each one of these 12 sons is the progenitor of 12 tribes. And they show up later on in Scripture and in the Bible. Not all of them, but a number of them too. And it gets even more interesting, and I think this is part of our understanding of God's sovereignty, is that even as Ishmael has 12 sons, later on, we haven't got there yet, but we're going to read about how Jacob, who is Isaac's son, has 12 sons, and they become really significant because his 12 sons become the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. In fact, these 12 individuals who were the sons of, indirectly sons of Abraham, sons of Isaac, sons of Jacob, when you get to heaven, there are going to be 12 gates in heaven. We read about this in the book of Revelation. And each one of them is named after one of those 12 sons. So that whole number 12 becomes really very significant in a lot of ways. And I just think it's interesting how it's mirrored between Ishmael and his 12 sons, and then Abraham's descendants and the 12 sons of Jacob. Well, we'll be digging into that a little more. There's one other really curious thing, which is also kind of a fulfillment of prophecy, is that back in Genesis 16:12, and again, God was talking about Ishmael, and he described him this way: he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. And it's interesting that as we look at the very last few verses in Genesis 25, it tells us that Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur. And here's the interesting part: and they lived in hostility toward all the tribes related to them. So this we talk about how between Abraham and Isaac there was this passing down of this godly character. And unfortunately, with Ishmael, he was described as being kind of like this wild donkey of a man. And it seems like those same traits get handed down to all of his descendants. And really, when we look at history, that is pretty much how it's played out. In fact, this whole animosity between the sons of Ishmael and the sons of Isaac has been going on throughout all history. You read about it all through the Bible. Now, the descendants of Ishmael really become the Arab people of today, and the different groupings that you can find amongst the Arab nations. And unfortunately, we're seeing in this world today how that whole thing has sort of carried itself out into our history today in this same animosity we see between these two people groups. Well, how do we conclude? What do we learn from all of this? Number one, I think it's pretty clear that God does have a plan in terms of what is right and what is wrong for families. And basically, when you spread things a little too thin and a guy decides he's going to have a number of wives. Now, I can see, as we said, that this might have been part of God's plan for him, his permissive plan for him, in order to fulfill prophecy, but it's still, he had to send a lot of his kids through Keturah, those kids, away, so there wouldn't be this contention. And as we said, we saw this in the life of David, we saw it in the life of Joseph and his brothers, and basically it's a formula that just doesn't work. And it's this true love between one man, one woman, and whatever children they have that works best. It's also, just a little side note, really sad to see how so many bad things happen when children grow up without parents, but especially without fathers. And that seems to be one thing that statistically is just undeniable. That if you find any kid that grows up without a father, the chances of them turning to a life of crime and poverty and all this bad stuff is just so much greater. So the importance of a father figure especially makes a huge difference within a family. Some of you, Gen Zers, you might be thinking, wow, as we talked about before, how important it is to find the right person to marry, just like, the Lord led Isaac to Rebekah and made that very clear. And you want to be very careful when you think about finding the person that you want to marry. Just like Abraham was glad to be able to pass down everything he had to his son Isaac, and indirectly to all of his children, we want to be able to pass on some really good things to our children. And there's another lesson here too, when we think about passing things down, this whole idea of inheritance. What do our children inherit from us? Well, money. I mean, it's nice to be able to leave some money behind to your kids. Sometimes we think, my wife and I think maybe we're spending some of our kids' inheritance when we go off and do a vacation or something like that. But I think we'll have a little bit left over to hand down to them. But that's really not that important, because not everybody has a ton of money to leave to their children. But the most important thing that we leave to them is our spiritual legacy. And we saw that in the life of Abraham and Isaac. There's a lot of parents that will give their kids all kinds of stuff, money and, gifts and lifestyle, and yet not give them what a kid really needs, and that's attention. I'm just too busy, so I'm going to give my kids money and, hopefully that'll buy them happiness. And unfortunately, just like the kids that have no fathers, these kids, money really isn't the factor at all. It's being left kind of alone with no help and no direction, and no direction from a your parents. So those are some really good lessons I think that we learn. The physical inheritance is not as important as the spiritual inheritance when we think about passing things down to our children. So yeah, this was just a bunch of names, if you just kind of skim over this chapter. But when you really see what was going on and you think about the ramifications of being a good parent and how that can have its effect throughout generations, I think there's a real important lesson for us. I would encourage you to, think about these things. You're maybe not anywhere near to having children yet, but you're in the process of building your life. And maybe if you are, you have to remember what is really important about being a parent. And that is the things that you give your kids beyond just, food and a warm place to live. So God teaches us some great lessons about that and the way he treats us. The gifts that God gives us are eternal. And the most precious gift that he's given us is his own son, so that we know that we can hang out with God forever. And it's not something we deserve, but it's something we receive because of his grace. So I hope this has been an encouragement to you. And next time we're going to be looking at a little bit more about the life of Isaac, as we have now left Abraham behind in our storyline. And there are some real spiritual lessons to be learned as we look at his life. So I hope you'll be able to join us next time on Gen Z Bible Class.